Okay, Boomer, he's no better than Dean Koontz. He's too liberal now. He's such a socialist. I can't stand him. I'm never reading a Stephen King book again. The year is 2024. Social media has allowed us to exist in an echo chamber of our own making. Every individual is supposed to have opinions about a variety of topics, even more so if you are a famous individual. But there's one big problem with this expectation. People are ignorant for the most part. We're not educated. We don't have the time to be up to date on all the latest information, to be nuanced in every political debate. And that's no different for famous individuals. Just because you're popular or you have millions of followers on X or Twitter, whatever you're calling it, does not mean your opinion is worth anything. This is not a problem I'll be able to tackle in a YouTube video. It's a problem with the culture. But when this phenomenon seems to leak over into one of my favorite fandoms, that's when it starts to bug me. Stephen King is one of the most successful authors of all time. He is a living legend whose oldest work, Carrie, turned 50 this year. The man has accomplished everything there is to accomplish in his field. That being said, he is just another individual living in the hellscape that is 2024, and his political views reflect that. Stephen King is my favorite author. I've been reading him for 4 years. I've never read anything from him that I did not enjoy. That being said, he is a flawed individual with flawed opinions, perhaps even short-sighted opinions. And because he's human and he's an artist, these opinions, his real-life experiences, are going to leak over into his art. I'm starting to see a rise in a very vocal minority among Stephen King constant readers. When you go to the one-star reviews on any of Stephen King's more recent books, they're just flooded with a bunch of political opinions. Stephen King is a leftist. Stephen King is a communist. He won't stop talking about Trump. This is why I'm not reading Stephen King anymore. I'm never reading another book from the author again because he's so political and he just can't shut up. He can't separate his personal views from his art. And then it got me to thinking, because up until a few months ago, I had a very limited view of Stephen King's bibliography. Most of the books I've read from Stephen King are from the last 20 years. So I'm very much a new Stephen King fan. So I just assumed that Stephen King being overly politicized was a relatively new phenomenon. That was until I read Shawshank Redemption. And I finished it and I was like, this work is considered one of his masterpieces. But no one talks about how political it is. So then I got to thinking, maybe it is the fan base. It is the world that has changed. Maybe Stephen King has remained the same. And that is what has led to my idea to do this video. Shawshank Redemption came out in 1982. But even by today's standards would be considered very left-leaning. It is a biting critique of the prison industrial complex and talks about corruption along the entire prison system. And it is very left-leaning. Stephen King did not shy away from saying very political things. Political statements like this. As far as that bunch of jumped-up Republican Rotarians in Augusta was concerned, there was only 3 viable expenditures of taxpayer money in the field of prison and corrections. Number 1 was more walls. Number 2 was more bars. And number 3 was more guards. After finishing Shawshank Redemption, I did some research, and I figured out that there is a plethora of very politically charged passages from his works from before the year 2000. So old Stephen King was a very political figure as well. And then I highlighted political passages from his 5 most recent works, and on average, all the passages from each novel took up less than a page. So you have people leaving 1-star reviews for his works being too politicized off of less than 350 words of content across several hundreds of pages per book. And that's just asinine. So this video is essentially going to be me coming to the defense of Stephen King, even though I don't agree with him about much anything. People are clearly upset about Stephen King's political positions. But why is that? And why doesn't it bother me despite the fact that I disagree with King about most issues? Social media is one of the great devils of our present day. That being said, I found myself being very thankful that Stephen King is incredibly active on Twitter because it gave me some valuable insight into his political beliefs and into his political positions that would not have been available 20, 30 years ago. Honestly, we could do an entire video about the divisive Twitter of Stephen King, but that honestly is not interesting to me and seems like a waste of time because Twitter, if it is anything, is just a cesspool of bad opinions and hate. Everyone on Twitter takes part in a stupid, dumbed-down political discourse, and Twitter is not a proper platform for intelligent political discussion. So I will forgive King for not having a very nuanced opinion about political matters on Twitter, because who does? Two of the most prevalent themes in Stephen King's massive bibliography are this: absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the dangers of fanaticism. Charismatic, rich dirtbags are very common in Stephen King's works, and they're almost always the villains. Religious fanaticism is always put in an evil light. Why is that? Stephen King, when he's not on Twitter, is a rational person at his core. And he does not forgive individuals who sacrifice their own ability to reason in subjection to a figure of authority, whether that be political or religious. That is why it is no surprise to me, and to most people probably watching this video, that Stephen King hates one individual above all others in America: former President Donald J. Trump. No matter what side of the political aisle you lean towards, Trump is a very divisive, controversial figure. Half of America, for the most part, thinks that he's the savior of the republic, and the other half thinks he's a traitor and he's a slave to foreign interest. In a healthy political climate, this would not be the discourse, because honestly, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but you get the political discourse you as a people deserve, and it's our fault that this is how the political conversation has devolved. King is very skeptical of populism and extremism, because he knows that power corrupts, and he knows that people generally don't make intelligent decisions when they are put in groups. Which I find very humorous, because clearly, if you were only to look at his social media presence, he is very much an extremist. Or at least that's what he appears to be. Ignore for 1 second that Stephen King is very much a part of the toxic political discourse on social media. He is a part of the problem, and I'm sure he would admit that, because he's a flawed individual, and he's going to give in to passions and emotions. And sometimes you're not going to think rationally. And that's just part and parcel of the political discourse in present day. So why would Stephen King go out of his way to mention Donald Trump or Republicans in his present day work? And the answer is simple. He loves bloat and he loves realism. Stephen King is the master of turning a 300-page book into a 500-page book. He is notorious for wasting the reader's time. He will spend pages and pages giving you the backstory to some throwaway character that he's just going to kill in 10 pages. He is the only author I've come in contact with that will regularly and routinely depict his characters going to the bathroom. Like, how many bathroom breaks do you read in other fiction that isn't Stephen King? Like, it's non-existent. But he spends the time to do that. It's not needed. It's not necessary. Some may even consider it sloppy. But it does contribute to Stephen King's works being incredibly realistic and immersive. It's very easy to relate to a character who is going to the bathroom, who's doing awkward things, who's thinking awkward thoughts, because we've all done those things. These are very realistic, real things that happen to everyday people. Stephen King's works are just real and raw. Many of his characters have anxieties, they have fears about the future, and they have opinions about politics. So how could he go out of his way to avoid capturing that aspect of our characters' lives, and to capturing those fears and those anxieties? Isn't that not what realism is all about? When Stephen King's characters have anxieties about the future and they fear certain political characters, that's very realistic. That's something we all deal with on a day-to-day basis. I think Stephen King would have to go out of his way to avoid talking about politics. And it's not his fault that we live in a very unique political environment that has not existed in the past 50 years. And I totally get it. I myself am experiencing political fatigue, and I've worked on 3 political campaigns from candidates that I'm sure Stephen King would hate, and I don't want my escapism to be tainted by current political events. But that's just who Stephen King is. But then you may say, isn't Stephen King alienating a part of his fan base? And to that I say, not quite. Stephen King is like punk rock or heavy metal music. He was never mainstream when he was up and coming. He didn't become mainstream until like the 2000s. He wasn't accepted by the mainstream culture until he was already heavily established. Like, he had to have several blockbuster movies come out from his works before people started realizing that he wasn't just a hack horror author. The establishment hated him. Churches hated him. Critics hated him. He really had to earn his spot. Stephen King wasn't written for everybody. It was written for the misfits. It was written for the disturbed, for the people that wanted to be scared, for the people who didn't care what others thought about their reading choices. So I think it's silly for Stephen King to not be a controversial figure now, because that's who he's always been. He's always been consistent in that way. I truly believe that many of Stephen King's old constant readers that are feeling disenchanted with his present day work are just upset because they're no longer the people that Stephen King writes for. When they were young in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of cool to read something that was kind of fringe. But now they're older, they're more established, and they're more set in their beliefs. So now when Stephen King goes off on a political tangent, it's very offensive and it's very jarring because we live in a world where you don't want to be exposed to ideas you disagree with on a day-to-day basis. So I honestly don't think Stephen King changed. I just think a large part of the constant reader fan base has just grown up and they're not politically aligned with Stephen King anymore. So is Stephen King a political extremist? I think the answer is clearly no. According to himself, he grew up Republican and became more Democrat as he aged and as he matured. Stephen King is center-left on the political compass, and I think that's just an example of how the present-day political discourse can make someone that's kind of moderately Democrat like Stephen King seem like an extremist, and how the political discourse in present day forces Stephen King to express his views in an extremist fashion, despite the fact that he's kind of middle of the road. Believe what you will about Stephen King's politics, but there's one virtue that he has that cannot be denied, and that is this. He puts his money where his mouth is, and he stands up for what he believes in. When his book Rage was loosely tied to several school shootings here in America, Stephen King made the executive decision to let that book go out of print. Here's an excerpt from his essay titled Guns. I didn't pull Rage from publication because the law demanded it. I was protected under the First Amendment, and the law couldn't demand it. I pulled it because, in my judgment, it might be hurting people, and that made it the responsible thing to do. So why do I find this so refreshing? And why does this make me respect Stephen King so much more as a person? We live in a day and age where individuals, corporations, political parties, governments, what have you, never take responsibility for the wrong things they do. You have to prove without a shadow of a doubt that somebody did something wrong before you even get an apology, and then you got to win the whole public opinion battle to make them actually change what they're doing. Rage would most definitely still be in print in the year 2024 if that is what Stephen King desired. Instead, he chose to do the right thing. Yes, you can argue he was already rich and successful at this point, and that taking one book out of print did not negatively affect him very much at all. But that's not the point. The fact is that he did the right thing. Stephen King has made an entire career out of writing about controversial material. There are several books in his bibliography that would get any author canceled in the year 2024. But what's the one book he took off the shelves? The one book that could loosely, possibly, might be related to individuals actually getting hurt. And how many of us would make that decision if it wasn't proven? And I ask you, how many people would have done the right thing in this circumstance? Speaking about his essay, Guns, I was flabbergasted by how balanced and well thought out it was. I was anticipating something incredibly left-leaning because I was only familiar with Stephen King's political leanings because of Twitter. But after reading Guns, it completely changed the way I view Stephen King when it came to his politics. And I'm glad that I did because he showed that he can engage in rational and nuanced discussion about a very controversial, very emotionally charged issue here in America, and I think he did it with a lot of insight and class. If everyone in America could just choose one issue they could think rationally about, this country would be a much better place. So there you have it. There's an example of Stephen King taking part in a very intelligent political discourse. But if this example does not sway you, perhaps I could appeal to your prejudices with some good old-fashioned bigoted ageism. Stephen King is a baby boomer. Stephen King is a baby boomer. He is 76 years old. He is the age of your grandparents or older. And if you compare him to other members of that generation, I think you can't help but view Stephen King in a more positive light. When you're together as a family, perhaps you're at a Thanksgiving dinner, and one of your grandparents says something entirely asinine, something that just shows how out of touch with the present day they truly are, you don't flip out. You don't leave the dinner because we're adults and we can handle our emotions. You just roll your eyes, smile uncomfortably, and eat some more turkey. We're all adults here. You can't separate the art from the artist. And at the end of the day, you get to decide what bothers you. Thank you guys for watching this video. It's not the sort of content I usually post on the channel. Don't be expecting more politicized rants from me, but it was kind of nice for one video to talk about my two loves: great stories and politics.